Thanks for that warm introduction, Rachel. Today I'm going to be talking about, are micro licenses unfairly targeted by Health Canada? It's a brief look at the myths and the pitfalls of operating as a micro or a nursery. A little bit about us, CannDelta, leading consulting company. We're also scientists and formerly with Health Canada. So if you have questions about how we can help you stay compliant or get a license, we're more than happy to chat. You can come visit us at CannDelta.com. Let's define a micro license. A micro license is a licensed subclass for cultivation or processing, and sometimes it includes nurseries. It allows a license holder to produce cannabis for the medical or the recreational market. Micro licenses, and now excluding nurseries, have limits on the amount of cannabis or cannabis products that they are permitted to produce. The goal for these license types is to create a low barrier point of entry for small businesses such as legacy or craft growers, farmers, or families to enter the regulated market and to begin producing cannabis through the legal framework. Nurseries, on the other hand, don't have the same limits, but they're often classified as the same category of license as it pertains to a lot of the requirements for getting a license application in and approved by Health Canada. So, true or false? It is easy to get a micro license. And currently, we're sitting at about just over 600 commercial production licenses across Canada for all license types. I'm going to say that this is mostly true. From the physical security side, you're not required to have any visual surveillance with a micro license. That means no high definition cameras everywhere. So the cost for implementing physical security, which has very expensive servers to retain all that 4K video data or high definition data of the perimeter, the storage, the operational rooms, is not required. You only need a few access control points for a micro, and those access control points can be made a little bit more simple than what we would typically see in a standard. So in a standard, we would have, for example, card readers on both sides of a door to record ingress and egress, for example, at the secured storage area. With micros, it's pretty commonly accepted to use timesheets in these areas, which requires a little bit of discipline to make sure that we're recording that information every time someone comes in or out. But you're not required to sort of have that same initial level of security investment. So from the physical security standpoint, this is mostly true. But this will change if you add in a sale for medical purposes license. Adding in this license to a micro subclass brings your physical security level up. So it would allow the license holder to sell to patients directly through an online portal, which is fantastic. That's another revenue stream for you to consider. But now your physical security requirements for a micro increase to a standard level. So one of the advantages of being a micro, and that's the cost savings for implementing your facility's physical security, are lost if we're also adding a sale for medical purposes license. From the fees perspective, this is certainly true. So security clearance fees are going to be the same. They're about $1,600 per person that goes on the application. Micros will typically have less people, less key personnel, less investors because it's a lower barrier to entry. So from that perspective, it could be true. But most importantly, the annual regulatory fees are only $2,500. For a standard, you're looking at a cool 23 racks a year to keep your license active. That's a lot of cash. But from the good production practices side, this is actually false. I think a lot of folks have a misconception that a micro license actually still means standard level of compliance as it pertains to GPP and record keeping. The pre-license expectations for a micro is that physical security requirements are definitely going to be relaxed. The post-license expectations, however, is that quality compliance standards and the expectations are equal for both the standard and a micro. This is a challenge. This is a challenge because micros typically have leaner operations with less people coming in and out. They have lower operational limits, and that restricts cash flow and the amount of annual revenue they can expect to come in every year. Good production practices are how we produce the product in a way that maintains the quality of that product to ensure that everything is safe for people to consume. It's one of the biggest advantages that we have of consuming products that are made from the legal framework. We know that those products are going to be safe because they're free of solvents, pesticides, other microbials, and as well as heavy metals. So that's fantastic because we don't get that same assurance from the illicitly sourced cannabis that folks sort of know and love. There's other issues surrounding quality, but there's been a lot of changes in the quality of the products that you can buy through the legal framework. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later in the presentation. So again, your standard operating procedures are going to be identical. You need to address pest control in the same way as you would. And for example, sanitation is going to be handled much the same way. Your storage, distribution, even how you build your building is going to be held to the exact same level as it would be for a standard. And I think this is a big misconception about folks coming into the micro-licensing world that have sort of preconceptions or maybe misconceptions about what operating there looks like. And it can be very different from operating as perhaps a legacy grower or a hobby grower. Another true or false question. True or false? Health Canada makes life tough for micro operators specifically. I'm going to say that's false. I don't think that Health Canada has it out to try to keep micros out of our regulated system. Micro operations on the whole tend to generally be less compliant than the other standard subclasses. So we need to ask ourselves why that is. For everyone, the regulations are more or less the same. They're very detailed. They are confusing. They leave a lot of room for interpretation. And even internally, we have a lot of discussion about how the regulations can be interpreted. And we've even seen some discrepancies between one Health Canada reviewer to another. At a business level, this could be perhaps due to a poor understanding across the board of the regulations and what the responsibilities of the license holder actually detail. Here's a picture of Joel Lascelles that was in the Winnipeg Free Press. He's the applicant for Hearst Organic. Hearst Organic is the first microcultivation license that was granted by Health Canada. And he says to save money where you can. There's a quote here that he put in the paper saying, my partner had a shovel, so we dug with his shovel and we saved a little bit of money there. But that's why I tell people, save your money, it's a long process. This is definitely true. Microcultivators need to be smart about how they're spending their money. And unless they have about $1 million in the bank to be able to build their facility and get licensed, they need to be very careful about how they're spending their money. Let's talk a little bit about the lessons learned. Do it yourself has its risks. Here's an example of two very different facilities, both applying for the same license subclass using similar materials. The one on the left represents a photo from a facility that was from a late-stage applicant who had their GPP report denied because the materials that they choose to build their rooms out of was a material called oriented strand board, or OSB. Oriented strand board is a very inexpensive plywood that can be used to build structure, and it has somewhat of a rough surface on it. The issue with OSB again, is that even after it's been coated several times with a sealant that could, for example, reduce or resist mold, mildew, and stand up to repeated scrubbings, there's still an inherent risk there that even after it's been coated, that there's a lot of, sort of rough surface for things like mold and mildew to settle upon. This picture in the middle, though, is what's actually taken from what we would call a compliant facility. This compliant facility used the same material, coated in very much the same way. And even though both of these facilities used the same material, one was approved and one was not. This can be very frustrating for folks because it gives sense that Health Canada is effectively moving the goalposts. Let's talk about some of the challenges that go with having leaner operations. Now, these photos are taken from our staff during site audits, and all the identifying information has been removed. These are actually from standard class license holders, but the challenges remain the same regardless of the license class. Here we see an example of not just a secured storage, but an operational area in which cannabis was being stored. Now, you can't store cannabis for long periods of time in an operation area unless it's a secured storage. In addition to that, the way that the cannabis was being stored was non-compliant. The cannabis was being stored in clear plastic bags that were unlabeled, and there was no identifying way to tell what lot or batch that this product was from as it was sitting on the racking system. The picture on the right at the top shows a rack that contained a whole bunch of bottles for cleaning supplies, many of which were not labeled and had no identifying information on them about who created them. There were no sign-off sheets on that information from the QAP. So again, that can be another issue. And it's something that seems, very benign. At the bottom, we saw these totes that were basically sitting there for days at a time of cut sugar leaves that were slated for destruction. Now that material has to be destroyed basically within the same shift that it becomes clipped from the plant. However, those totes were sitting there for days. And then the last photo at the bottom right, That shows puddles of water that we had seen. And again, running along some irrigation systems, a ton of cannabis that was unable to sort of be swept away was sitting there rotting. These issues are going to be the same regardless of who you're working with or what license class you actually have. Again, the challenge comes from having less people to sort of pitch in and do the work is going to make this, I think, an increased challenge for folks that are operating with fewer staff. So where do we go from here? It's really about creating a culture of compliance within your workplace. It's very important that we all understand our general responsibilities and obligations as an employee at a license holding facility. We need experienced staff, and for those staff that aren't as experienced, they need ways to acquire access to that information and get trained. Record keeping is going to be key. A good QA system is going to be very, very important to understand that, if we make mistakes, that there's something in process to help us fix those mistakes, some kind of corrective and preventative action measures. Sanitation is going to be key on this as well. One of Health Canada's favorite things to inspect when they come to a facility is logbooks that show cleaning schedules. This is, again, very important when applying for a sales amendment as well. Those can be one of the first things an auditor will ask for when they sit down at the table and introduce themselves and explain what's going to happen during today's site audit, which was very much a surprise for you and your staff. So inspection preparedness is super important, as well as training and vendor qualification. This all fits into that culture of compliance, and it's not something that needs to be held by the folks that are working in the operations space. It's everyone's job. Let's come back to why craft has a lot of inherent value in it. You can't beat craft quality. If we look at the number of plants per person working there, craft simply can't be beat. Each plant is getting so much care and attention, and the way that those products are handled once they've been harvested is unparalleled from what we would see at a standard license holder operation. Using something like automatic trimmers and these automatic dispensing machines that weigh things out, a lot of the trichomes on the products are going to be broken off, snapped off. The product just isn't the same when you put it under the microscope and have a really good look at it versus something you would get from craft, which has a lot of care in the product. Everything is handled by hand, it's hand trimmed, rack dried, not necessarily in that order. That really distinguishes products, and there's a huge demand for craft right now. And as a result, there are a lot of market share opportunities and additional revenue streams that these products can take. For example, there are two lines offered by the OCS now called small batch and handcrafted. The small batch or craft cannabis brand has to be from a facility that produces less than 10,000 kilograms. So any micro cultivator would be eligible to be part of that small batch program. And then the handcrafted line would be hand trimmed, hand packaged product. Again, ensuring the quality of the product. With a customer and patient focused culture, micros are really paving the way for creating the next unique cannabis product lines. The nice thing about being a micro is that you're really accountable to your customers. You're not accountable to directors and like you are in larger corporations. So the ability to pivot is a lot more accelerated there versus as it would be if you're working in a bigger company. As a result, you're much more in contact with your customers, and that happens a lot even through social media. So when folks are being vocal about something, it's very easy to adapt and make amends on any issues. From a revenue standpoint, micros can be very profitable. This is obviously going to fluctuate depending on what the grams per or the dollars per gram that you can seek out for your dried flower. And again, with microcultivation, we're limited to canopy size of about 200 square meters. From the microprocessing side, that's 600 kgs of product you can process. If you're a micro and a processor, which is a great business model, you can process everything that you grow. The canopy size is going to include everything from anything with a leaf. So that includes clones, mothers, veg, and flowering. Assuming that we can get 4 harvests per year, 1 plant per square foot, maybe about 50 grams per plant, at a wholesale value of $3 Canadian per gram of dried flower, your estimated annual revenue is set to be about $1.3 million. Of course, that's going to depend on what prices are going for dried flower and the cannabinoid profile in that dried flower as well. That's still very awesome for a few person company. In addition, we've seen that the illicit market prices over time have stayed relatively constant, while the price of regulated cannabis has actually come down significantly, making it more competitive. We're seeing a huge shift from folks purchasing from the legacy market coming over to the retail, the legal retail market and purchasing from their local retail stores. This is very, very encouraging. This is definitely a reason to consider if you're operating as a legacy grower, moving into the regulated market to take advantage of this. It's about achieving long-term success in the long run, so it's very important that if you want to go down the road of becoming a micro, that you plan your business. You want to know how to operate and what you're actually going to do when you get your license. The advantage here is that micros can pivot very, very quickly. So if you need to maybe change cultivars or go in a different product line direction, you can do that. And you don't need very much approval to do that as well. So there's a lot of advantage of being a smaller, leaner operation. We recommend applying or considering applying for a microprocessing and a sales amendment if you're a micro cultivator. This will offer you the most flexibility to package your own product and to be able to sell that product directly to the provincial wholesalers as well. And that's going to be very important if you want brand recognition. I think that some micro cultivators have a sense that they've been defeated if they're spending all this time developing a craft product, ultimately just to sell it off to someone else who's going to white label it as their own. It's important to create a culture of compliance within your workspace, and that responsibility belongs to everyone, and that includes the CEO. And for long-term success, think about mock audits. Someday Health Canada is going to come by, and they're going to ask to see a few things. So being prepared for what they're actually going to ask for will set you up for long-term success. So you're having a much more pleasant conversation as opposed to those awkward conversations when, for example, your sanitation records aren't exactly what Health Canada auditors were expecting. Have you been unfairly targeted by an auditor? We invite you to share your experience with us. We'd love to hear it. You can reach out to us using the email address on the screen or use social media at CannDelta. I'll now pass it on to my associate from LabStat, Devin.